They didn't gather in temples of marble, but in rooms lit by oil, not beneath domes and doctrine, but in hope and flickering resistance. Their teacher was gone, but his tactics remained, etched into memory, burned into flesh, carried like contraband through the cities of Caesar. Turn the other cheek, he said. Well, that exposed the fist. Feed the poor, unravel the logic of wealth. Forgive, and break the empire's cycle of blood and violence. Fast and pray. Not for escape, but for endurance. The Sermon on the Mount wasn't poetry. It was policy. It was a playbook. Every teaching was a tactic, every blessing a battle cry. When the plague came, they stayed. When the sword came, they knelt. When abandonment ruled, they fed the forgotten. Jesus didn't build a religion. He launched a revolution. And the revolution became a movement, not of survival, but of resurrection. Rome had swords, and the church had scars. Rome built temples. The church built tables. And what was crucified in Jerusalem multiplied in Antioch. A movement not maintained by fear, but in mercy. The movement wouldn't die because it was never founded on survival. It was founded on resurrection. I am John, and this is Gospel Politic, where faith meets justice and the truth refuses to stay silent. So the Sermon on the Mount wasn't symbolism, it was strategy. And his death wasn't the end, it was the deployment. In our last episode, we looked at this guy here, right? I keep it on my desk. I love this freaking little book, Jesus and Nonviolence, A Third Way by Walter Wink. And we utilized his ideas in our last episode. This is the third episode in this series, by the way. In our last episode, we reframed Jesus' teachings as insurgent tools. So turn the other cheek revealed unjust power dynamics, for example. Go the extra mile, weaponize dignity against humiliation. Love your enemies undermined Rome's logic of terror, oppression, revenge, violence. This wasn't abstract piety. It was street-level strategy. And Jesus wasn't just crafting a doctrine, he was training disruptors. When he healed, he destabilized purity hierarchies. He ate with outcasts and dismantled exclusionary economics. His refusal to be enthroned, which we see, look at John 6, the Gospel of John chapter 6. His refusal to be enthroned was a rejection of the very structures empire tried to co-opt. And so Rome saw the subversion. Jesus was executed as a political criminal from the Roman perspective for insurgency. His teachings spread among the poor and colonized. His influence disrupted both temple and Roman order. His claim to kingdom was a theological threat with political ramifications. Crucifixion was a spectacle, imperial spectacle. It was meant to shame and silence and ultimately scatter. And this is what we see in the time of Jesus. Jesus is not the only Jewish revolutionary who would find himself on a cross. That's history. And what usually would happen is this crucifixion, this imperial spectacle, would scare and scatter and end that revolution, end that movement. And we don't really remember unless you research and look into, you'll find out there were other pretty famous Jewish revolutionaries in the time of Jesus. But what Rome labeled as defeat, the disciples of Jesus recognized as defiance. Something was different about Jesus. Here we are, 2,000 years later, talking about him and not the 50 would-be other crucified Jewish revolutionaries. So the cross wasn't the movement's tomb. It became its torch. So after this crucifixion, the first followers stood on a razor's edge. At this crossroads, there was a decision to make. Would they enshrine Jesus with memory? That's one option. Or would they emulate Jesus with life? Would they embody his teachings and what he had to bring? They chose the second. They chose to run his tactics. They chose to live and operate and execute his way. And baptism, just on a level from like a Roman Empire perspective, if you look at the history and look at the ups and downs of Christian persecutions, baptism became a public disavowal of Caesar. Remember, to say that Jesus is Lord is to say that Caesar is not. Communion remembered not just death, but resistance through body and community. House churches recreated the inclusiveness Jesus practiced daily. They weren't just commemorating a martyr, they were continuing his mutiny. In this episode, we will also utilize a scholar, a historian, Rodney Stark, particularly his work, Rise of Christianity. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. But Rodney Stark's sociological research confirms what history whispers. Early Christianity spread not through comfort, but through confrontation. And Stark shows this in a few ways. One, Christians stayed behind during plagues, practicing sacrificial mercy. And we're going to look at that more in depth here shortly. This is huge. They welcomed women, enslaved persons, and the poor, upending imperial caste systems. They grew organically through proximity and presence, not power or prestige. This was charity as strategic resistance. The early church didn't survive because it adapted to Rome. It actually flourished because it rejected Rome's imperial survival logic. Where empire hoarded strength, the church practiced weakness, and it grew. Jesus launched a movement, and Rome, of course, launched the crackdown. The church launched a revolution. He wasn't meant to be only remembered. Jesus was meant to be repeated. He was meant to be embodied. So let's look at a little bit of history here. There are two plagues that caused a lot of suffering and problems for Rome. When empire abandoned its sick, the church stayed. And when exclusion was policy, the church chose to embrace. See episode 1 of this series, where we looked at Wolff's theology of embrace in contrast against the empire's ideology of exclusion and power religion's idea of dominance and exclusion. The church didn't resist by seizing power. They resisted by embodying mercy. And so let's look at the plague response. Mercy as subversion. Now, during the Antonine plague and the plague of Hyperion, the imperial infrastructure, as you can imagine, collapsed. And it collapsed under contagion and fear. Post-COVID, we're in 2025. Not that long ago, we remember 2020. We remember what, even with our modern day technology and everything that we have, all of our resources, our society was ground to a halt. There are businesses that left and closed down, never to return. Loved ones and family members gone. Post-COVID, when I look at the plagues of Rome, when I look at the Middle Ages, the bubonic plague, even 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, I look at that and I study that, and it hits a little bit differently now, having lived through the epidemic of our own. And so imperial structure, we know, collapsed under contagion and fear. Yet, here's the thing, Christians stayed. They defied Rome's survival logic. Rodney Stark writes this in his work, The Rise of Christianity. To cities filled with the homeless and the impoverished, Christianity offered charity as well as hope. And to cities faced with epidemics, fires, and earthquakes, Christianity offered effective nursing services. They didn't just care, they disrupted. Their mercy exposed the cruelty of Roman abandonment. Even the Emperor Julian admitted defeat. These impious Galileans not only feed their own poor, but also ours also. They attract them as children are attracted to cakes. I love that quote. Christianity had become a rival welfare state fueled by love, not law. They didn't pray for escape. They practiced endurance. And we also see this inclusive community undermining the empire's castes. Where empire excluded, the church invited. Women flocked to the Jesus movement, drawn by ethics that affirmed rather than erased. Stark also explains here, Christian morality offered dignity over domination. House churches elevated voices normally silenced. Unwanted daughters, often discarded, were taken in and raised. This wasn't just spiritual reform. It was a social revolution. Empire built walls. The church built tables and invited everyone to have a seat and to be part of the family. This is a hot topic now, is martyrdom. Martyrdom worked as a strategic visibility. See, martyrdom wasn't blind zeal. It was tactical, rational, and very effective. Rodney Stark reframes it powerfully here. He says, sacrifice and stigma were the dynamo behind the rise of Christianity. The factors that created strong organizations filled with highly committed members ready to do what needed to be done. Elsewhere, not Martin Luther, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. I got in trouble recently, not in trouble, but I got a lot of slack, which I still have the same view, with Charlie Kirk's death. And if you guys haven't checked it out, the podcast, Gospel Politic, we have an entire episode called Charlie Kirk and the Imago Dei, where we, through the teachings of Jesus, affirm a couple things. One is that Charlie Kirk is in the image of God. His death is terrible. It's a crime. And then the second thing we had to affirm, is based on martyrdom, based on history, based on the teachings of Jesus, Charlie Kirk was not a martyr. He actually embodied and taught a way and taught things that were antithetical to the way of Jesus and his teachings. We also have a whole episode, in our first episode of Hooded Church is out. Hooded Church, we talk about the Great Replacement Theory, which is a heresy, a theological reversal of the way of Jesus that was taught by Charlie Kirk. For more details, check that out. Being murdered in cold blood does not make you a martyr. Being martyred as a witness to Jesus, and for that reason makes you a martyr. That's not Charlie Kirk. But martyrs didn't seek death. That's not what they looked for. They sought to expose violence, embody conviction, and invite transformation. Their blood preached what pulpits could not. The blood of the martyrs was a testimony. We also see the church had organic growth. This is because I believe they embraced and practiced proximity over power. Here's what we mean. The church didn't scale by conquering territory. It grew through presence. And Stark dismantles the myth of institutional conversion in these kind of three areas. Let me just kind of summarize. One, Christianity moved in the early days after Jesus. Christianity moved from home to home. Another thing we see is Christianity spread by meals, stories, and gestures of love and grace and mercy, such as picking up a plague victim. Let me go back to the plagues real quick. When a plague would hit Rome and a family member was sick, that family member usually was cast outside into the street for the safety of the rest of the family. So they were cut off. Even the richest of the rich found themselves in this situation. Christians would go out and seek those who were thrown off and dying in the street. They would pick them up, take them to a safe place, a room with a bed, and they would care for them and nurse after them until that person was well again or until they died. And in the meantime, the Christian nurse, whoever was caring for this sick person, would stay with them and care for them, even if it meant that they would get sick themselves and die. And if that would happen, they were replaced by another Christian who would come in, take their place, and care for this dying person. Very remarkable. This is the way of Jesus. Also, we see Christianity, the early days of Jesus, his movement in that community thrived in relational webs, not cathedral walls. And this mirrored the rabbi they followed. No palace, no platform. The Son of Man has no place to lay his head, but just kitchens, sandals, proximity, and presence. Empire shouted from palaces. The church whispered from kitchen. When the cross became a banner instead of a burden, Rome didn't convert. It colonized. The empire didn't kneel at the feet of Jesus. It dressed him in regalia and called him its own. For the first 3 centuries, Christianity was a faith of the margins. It took root in catacombs and slums, not palaces. It was dangerous, disobedient, disruptive. Christians refused to bow to Caesar, refused to carry weapons in his name, refused to fit the mold of respectable citizenry. The church was not aligned with empire. It stood against it. It offered care where Rome gave abandonment. It offered dignity where the empire dealt in conquest. It lived on the edge, fully aware that proximity to Jesus meant proximity to peril. Then came Constantine, a new emperor. And in 313, Common Era, the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity. The persecution stopped, but something deeper began. Constantine wasn't just ending the violence. And if you look, he didn't end violence against Christians. He was rewriting allegiance. He saw in the church a tool, a unifying force for a fragmented empire. Think about this. At the time that Constantine comes to power, among the Roman citizens, I'm not talking about the slave class, which is a lot more people, but among the citizens of Rome, 10%, it's estimated, 10% of citizens were Christians. That number is a lot higher amongst the slave class and the non-citizens. Christianity is growing through this organic movement, through kitchens, through gestures, through welfare, through nursing, through charity, through love. This revolution is gaining through the blood of the martyrs. All these things are working, this organic outworking, this power of the movement of Jesus. Jesus' teachings on the ground, rubber meets the road, cannot even be contained by the Roman Empire. A smart emperor is going to figure out another way, because the Colosseum and the lions and the making it illegal and the persecution is not helping our cause. It's not helping the empire. We're losing. So I give Constantine credit there. So he baptized the Christian movement. He baptized it, not into death and resurrection, but into Roman authority. Suddenly, the cross, once a symbol of state execution, was emblazoned on war banners. Baptism became a matter of imperial convenience, not spiritual rebirth. The church gained favor, but it lost something more crucial, I believe. Its prophetic witness. And the theology followed suit. God was reframed, not as liberator of slaves and a friend of outcasts, but as divine patron of political order. Jesus was reimagined, not as foot washer and table flipper, but as celestial emperor robed in glory. The radical ethics of the Sermon on the Mount, replaced with just war theory and civic obedience. Church leaders no longer stood with the poor. They governed like emperors. Bishops held court. Clergy wielded civil power. The gospel was no longer a threat to the empire. It became its weapon. Rome hadn't surrendered to the kingdom. It swallowed it whole. And this is a big point that we make here on Gospel Politic. The empire, the way the empire can control is by hijacking a moral religious framework that's popular. And in this case, in the Western civilization, it's been Christianity. And they hijack it for their own means. Meanwhile, the true followers of Jesus are the ones that are standing the most against empire. They are the ones, ironically, being persecuted by the Christian establishment. We see this from the time of Constantine, who burnt down churches of any groups that refused to recognize his churches and his bishops. In this imperial shift, scripture was weaponized. Romans 13, remember? Again, we have a whole episode on Romans 13. Romans 13, once a reflection on civic humility. I mean, Romans 13, if you read the whole passage in context, literally Paul is laying out what is a just government that we should submit to. And the conclusion and the inference is that an unjust government should not be submitted to. Unjust laws are to be disobeyed. But once a reflection of civic humility, Romans 13 became a mandate for blind obedience to state power. Violence was sanctified. Colonial conquest was wrapped in missionary zeal. Resistance movements, once central to Christian witness, were branded as heretical. We see that the mystics, the monastics, the radicals were pushed to the fringe, not because they stayed away from Jesus, but because they remembered him rightly and still sought to embody him, even as empire had hijacked the church. And yet, the flame never died. Over the centuries, dissent refused extinction. For example, Waldensians preached from caves. The Lollards carried scripture in secret. Anabaptists practiced communal life beneath threat. Each one whispered back the words Rome tried to silence. Jesus was crucified, not crowned. And in every generation, voices rose from the margins to say, we remember, we refuse, we reclaim. They dressed him in robes. He stripped them away. They gave him a throne. He chose a cross. If we've crowned Jesus with empire, maybe it's time to remember the man who overturned tables. For centuries, the church has preached Jesus as Savior, but it has often forgotten him as the revolutionary that he was. The Jesus of Constantine wore gold. The Jesus of the Gospels wore dust. One was enthroned in empire. The other was executed by it. To reclaim Jesus as a revolutionary who confronted systems of domination with a radical love, disruptive mercy, and a tactical defiance. He didn't die to start a religion. He died because his movement threatened the religious and political order. He died to conquer empire, to conquer domination systems, to conquer sin and death itself. He healed on the Sabbath, not to comfort, but to confront. He dined with tax collectors, not to endorse empire, but to expose its reach. He told the rich to get everything away, not as a metaphor, but as a mandate. Blessed are the poor wasn't poetry. It was policy. Turn the other cheek wasn't passivity. It was protest. Jesus didn't just teach resistance. He embodied it. He is resistance. He refused to be crowned. He refused to retaliate. He refused to abandon the marginalized. And when the empire came for him, he didn't run. He walked toward the cross, not as a victim, but as a provocation. You want to silence me? He seemed to ask. Then let my death become your indictment. To reclaim Jesus is to reclaim the tactics of the kingdom. Nonviolence that exposes violence. Solidarity that dismantles hierarchy. Communion that defies exclusion, truth-telling that refuses theological compromise. This is not nostalgia. It's insurgency. The church must stop worshiping the revolutionary it refuses to follow. Jesus doesn't need our songs. He doesn't need our elevation worship or Hillsong. It's not what he needs. He commands our solidarity. If he is Lord, then Caesar is not. Rodney Stark showed us that Christianity didn't rise because it was safe. It rose because it was sacrificial. It grew plague-ridden cities because Christians stayed when others fled. It spread through women and the poor because it offered dignity where empire offered death. And it lost its fire when it gained the throne. So here's the challenge. If you follow Jesus in America today, don't chase influence, chase integrity. Don't seek power, seek proximity to the suffering. Don't settle for cultural Christianity, resurrect the revolution. Because if the church once grew by mercy in the face of misery, let it grow again by refusing empire, embracing the cross, and living a gospel that costs something. This isn't nostalgia. It's a summons, a lineage of holy troublemakers who didn't flinch, didn't fold, didn't forget. From catacombs to cotton fields, from execution stakes to protest lines, their gospel wasn't safe, it was incendiary. So if something here is stirring in you, you're invited to join us. Share this episode, like, subscribe, leave a review, a comment. We're pretty small. I'm not hard for me to respond to you. Let's start a conversation. Let's let it echo across timelines and pulpits, algorithms and sanctuaries and underground rooms of resistance. I'm John, and this is Gospel Politic, where faith meets justice and the truth refuses to stay silent.